Okay, we're ready.
Good morning. For our adult education class today, we're going to talk about, Laura and I are going to talk about James Fowler's book, Stages of Faith, which was published by Harper and Row in 1981. This is a book about how religious faith evolves, or at least can evolve, and it draws on Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget's work on cognitive development and Lawrence Kohlberg's work on the stages of moral development. I benefited from that when I first read it, and have recommended it to students and friends who were wrestling with matters of faith. And I learned that Laura also admires it, and we thought it was worth talking about. I had typed 6 pages of close notes, and I was worried a bit about condensing that. And I wondered in the process if Jim Fowler, whom I knew pretty well at Harvard Divinity School in the 1960s, is still alive. So I checked Wikipedia. Well, it happens that he died in 2015, but the article summarized his theory in 25 lines. So if you want to get a very quick view, you can go to James Fowler and Stages of Faith on Wikipedia. The titles of the stages include things like intuitive projective faith and synthetic conventional faith and individuative reflective faith. I'm not going to use those in this discussion because it may need to be filled out more to make sense. The process starts at a kind of a stage zero or a pre-stage, primal or undifferentiated faith, from birth to about 2 years. And this is characterized by early learning related to the safety of the environment. If the environment is warm, safe, and secure, as compared to or contrasted to being hurtful, neglectful, and abusive. If children experience a warm, safe, consistent nurture, they will develop a sense of trust and safety of the universe and the divine that prepares them for belief in super empirical power. Conversely, neglect or abuse may lock them into patterns of isolation and failed mutuality and cause them to develop distrust of other people and the universe and the divine as well.
So I want to make sure everybody heard because the internet connection is not great. We're on Zoom, everybody, and we're doing Education Hour together from our own homes. And I just think it's really kind of funny that Wikipedia managed to summarize everything. And was it 25 lines? Is that what you said?
I counted them twice.
Okay.
I was humble.
So on this stage, the thing I kept thinking about is when a child falls and isn't going to cry, but then looks up and sees a parent and then cries, because if the child has had that foundational trust that care will be provided, then the child knows that the parent will come and kiss and care and tend. And so to me, that's a good picture of what this stage of faith is like. It's the trust, the belief that care will be provided.
As children begin to speak, or well, let's say ages above ages 2 to about 7 in this description, as they begin to speak, children begin to name objects in their environment: tree, light, toy, baby. They're reconfirming that the world is made up of dependably permanent objects. And I remember when Rex, our oldest son, was about 14 months old, but already had a brother, he kept saying, "Daddy, Mama, Jeff. Daddy, Mama, Jeff." So, I got this. What we're here. But as they move along, approximately ages 3 to 7, religion is learned mainly through experiences, stories, images, and the people that one comes in contact with. The imagination develops, and that can produce long-lasting images and feelings, both positive and negative. They can be inspired by stories of heroic, brave, selfless people of visible faith, or frightened by images of terror and destruction, as in early hellfire preaching that reinforces various taboos.
Exactly. I don't know about you, Bill, but I had some of that horrifying preaching every now and again when I was in this age group. Um, Grayson is in this category. He's 6 now. And I was thinking about how much he uses naming things and stories to make sense of his life. And we all do that to a certain extent, but he embodies it. He acts it out in play. So he still plays Harvey games. It's not a game. It's a, he puts Lego men on top of a house and says that they're getting away from the flood, or he washes cars in the sink because they've been flooded. And it's months now since that, since Harvey, and he's still working through these things with story and still using his imagination to make sense of them. It's also interesting when we talk about faith development and the Bible, that this age group doesn't have any trouble with the stories in the Bible because they're not worried about, I want to say truth, and I don't mean that. They're not worried about whether it happened or not. They're true, but whether they happen or not is, debatable. But a 5-year-old is not worried about whether you could fit all those animals in the ark. That's just not a question they ask. And so these biblical stories take on, a world and imagination life of their own, which is interesting.
Well, in the next phase, typically starting around 10, children are likely to have a strong belief in justice and the reciprocity of the universe, and their deities are almost always anthropomorphic. And they approach it, if I do this, God will respond in such and such a way. And during this time, metaphors and symbolic language are often misunderstood and taken literally.
And in our culture, it is the case that children have an image of God by 5, even if that child is not religious in any way. Just in our culture, there's so much talk about God and religion that a child has an image, and almost always that image is of an old, white, judging man. And without active work to counter that image, to talk about God as mother, God as love, God as shepherd, God as, all the different ways we think about God, then that's what they come away with. And it's been interesting to see Owen, who's in this stage, he's 12 now, he just turned 12 in February, who has grown up at Covenant, but still, because of culture, he'll say things like, oh, if I do that, God will get me. And I'll say, what do you mean, right? And then we had these really interesting conversations, and he doesn't mean it in a literal way. He means it, he's heard people talk about this, that if you do something wrong, that God will be mad at you, and it won't be good. And he hasn't heard that at church, but he's heard it enough from friends and in the culture that it's there. So I've been interested in watching him move in and through that, and offering ideas of God as love, and God as care, and God as the breath we breathe, and right, giving other images. And still, even with that, there's such a focus on judgment and fairness.
Well, that's certainly true. And the next stage, which encompasses adolescence to adulthood, perhaps early adulthood, involves recognizing clashes or contradictions in authoritative stories, which leads to reflections on meanings and a breakdown of literalism. That can lead to disillusionment with previous teachers and teachings. Were they telling me the truth? But a sense of need for a more personal relationship with an ultimate unifying power, if there is one, can also lead to development of a personal religious identity and outlook that synthesizes one's own values and information and experience that fits in with one's personality.
I think so many people, Bill, and I wonder about your experience too, but so many people don't get any further than this, right? They experience their first tragedy or their first encounter with something that makes their worldview or their image of God no longer viable to them. And then they just stop. Then they say, well, that's it. That's enough. I'm not religious. I don't believe in God anymore. And it's a hope of mine that by adding to the way we imagine God, the way we image God, that we help people not stop here. That just because one idea you had about God has proved to be incorrect doesn't mean all ideas about God are incorrect. My divinity school thesis was called Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child, the Transformation of God Images Through the Experience of Suffering. And in that, I just talked about the value of God image and how God image changes. And I interviewed people who had one idea of God and then experienced great tragedy and had a new idea of God at the other side of it. And even without great tragedy, almost all of us hit this stage in life and something happens that means that the way we had understood God is challenged. And so then the beauty is if we can just keep going, right? If we can keep going to the next stage and the next stage. And it's not a race. It's not like you get one and then you get another. And, it doesn't quite work that way. But I wonder if you've experienced that too, that people get here and then they stop.
Oh, sure. And Fowler notes several times, these are stages that that are good to move through, but not everybody does. People may persist in a prior stage of development. But in times it fits you, I think, but mid-20s to late 30s, you often do, in a healthy development, take personal responsibility for his or her beliefs and feelings. And by this time, you're likely to give at least minimal credence to unconscious factors that influence our judgment and behavior. By this time, we may have taken sociology or psychology and have learned something about aggressiveness, the roots of self-image, birth order, the effects of socialization, the power of systems and institutions to affect social relations, and so forth. And we come to understand, or we should, that we do not behave with perfect free will, and to recognize that life is more complex than one had believed. Now, ideally, that occurs at least in early adulthood. It can happen in one's 30s or 40s, but as you have said, and I agree, it may never happen, that people may get stuck in a prior stage of development and say, hey, I don't want to move.
Yeah. Well, I think that one reason that happens is, when we confront and embrace the complexity, right? That it's not, here it is, right? The stage where Owen is, where there's a right answer and a wrong answer. But when we've come to see that, no, that actually there are kind of lots of answers, and it depends on factors, and it depends on what angle you're using and what lens, and there's so many variables. And I think that can be so frightening for some people that they choose to stick with, no, here are the answers. And, I know exactly what to do and how to do it. And I'm sticking with that. And I think so often that's not about intelligence. It's about safety. It's about managing anxiety and fear, that it can be comforting to have the answers. I know for me that wasn't comforting, partly because, early on in my stage development process, my mom died when I was 9. And that's when my previous ideas about God were completely challenged. I couldn't understand that if a God loved me, would also be a God who would will my mother's death. That didn't make any sense to me. So, I think it depends. Well, and I'm in this stage, as you noticed. So I'm saying it depends on your experience, which is exactly what I should be saying. Yeah.
Well, in moving along in the next stage, which Fowler calls conjunctive faith, and he says it's unusual before midlife. This involves resolving the conflicts from the previous stages by a critical recognition of a social unconscious, myths, ideal images, prejudices that are built into one's self-system by virtue of class, religious tradition, ethnic group, family, and, as you have pointed out, the critical kinds of events and things that have happened to you. And if it's successful, this involves the development of what some have called a second naivete. It recognizes that truth has more dimensions than one had realized, and appreciates the deeper truths of myths. The 1988 PBS 6-hour series Joseph Campbell and the Power of Myth with Bill Moyers was an illuminating exploration of this phenomenon. And you can watch parts of it free by using the Google machine, or you can get the whole thing from Amazon for about $12. And it's something that you might enjoy if you happen to have any free time these days. But people, people in this stage have the capacity to see and to be in one's own and one's group's most powerful meanings, while also recognizing that they are relative, partial, and distorting, but also to be drawn by the possibility and imperative of an inclusive community of being.
And I'm going to claim for myself 1 foot in this stage and 1 foot in the other, since the other stopped at late 30s, and I won't tell you my age, but it goes past that. And this stage, you know, I think we talk about this a lot at Covenant. We talk about the power of the story, right? So this is a faith that stopped asking, did this happen? And has started asking, what does it mean? What does the story mean? Where can I find myself in the story? Where do I see others and God in the story? So this is, you know, these are our sacred stories kind of a faith. And in many ways, like you said, it's another naivete. It's Grayson's faith, just all grown up, where stories are how we make meaning, and stories are how we know who we are and know our place in the world and know what matters. And story, not in a bad word way. Story is amazing, right? It's when story and myth stop being made up and start being how we make sense. I think, or you know, that's what I would add.
Well, I think that's quite good, and I always like the fact that we say these are our sacred stories.
Me too.
And sometimes when I'm think about other possibilities, I think, but these are my stories. These are my songs.
Yes.
Individuals in the what they call the last stage, or the highest stage of universalizing faith, individuals in this stage will view all people as part of a universal community who should be treated with universal principles of love, justice, and compassion. Their words and actions have an extraordinary and often unpredictable quality, and they may offend parochial perceptions of justice and standards of righteousness, goodness, and prudence. People like this, and there aren't too many, they're often experienced as subversive of structures. So it's little wonder that they frequently become martyrs, dying at the hands of those they hope to change. Examples that we can think of are Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Abraham Heschel, Thomas Merton, Bishop Oscar Romero, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Reverend William Barber, and many others not so well known, but who evince a total trust in the principle of being. They are enemies of all idolatrous gods, the nations, self, tribe, family, institutions, success, money, sexuality, and so forth. All of these are relativized as they seek a unity expressed in the vision of what Christians call the kingdom of God. They're not to be identified with absolutes that adherents of given religious traditions may fashion about them. Their faith is not exclusivistic. It takes different forms in different contexts. They kindle our imagination by their generosity, their authority, their freedom, and their costly love.
And they changed the world, right? That list of people, they changed the world, and thank God. So we hope this has been helpful. And Bill and I both own the book if you want to borrow it. But you have to wait till this is all over and we can do things like see each other and borrow books. And
I was going to do a picture of it, but it's in my office at Rice.
See? I think we wanted to make sure that we reiterated that it's not that you hit one stage and then your goal is to get to the next stage and then the next. It's not like that. It's not a competition or a race. But for me, this book, and I read it in college, Bill, and for me, the gift of it was I went oh, I'm not the only one, and this is normal. And you know, it was a real gift to me to see that what I was experiencing in my own evolution of faith was a pattern that other people had also experienced. And that was very valuable for me.
Indeed, a similar kind of thing to me was I read it when I was, well, it was 1981, so I was already 40. But I thought about some of those things in that way and had teachers like Paul Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr when I was at the Harvard Divinity School. And at times I thought, what they're saying is, it's too deep for me right now, but I'm going to remember this and come back to it later. And that has helped. And reading this book, and especially was meaningful to me to know the person who really wrote it and who wrote it, and think he's a good guy. I'm gonna look up. I read it, just picked it up because Jim Fowler had read it. Let's see what he's doing these days. And I thought, wow, this is really, really good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the reminder that faith is not void of doubt or questions, that those are part and parcel of faith. And to have a whole book that shows us that is really great. Okay, well, we hope this has been helpful. Say it again, Bill.
I just said it's always good to talk with you.
Always good to talk to you. All right, bye everybody.